the Buffalo shooting in the United, where 10 people were killed. That was a racist killing. All 4 of those killings were inspired by the Great Replacement theory. When they wrote their manifestos, they either explicitly said Great Replacement, or their writing implied that they were committing these acts because they were afraid that people of color, either Black or immigrants, were coming over to take over, right? And oftentimes this theory says that the Jewish population is the one behind this supposed, puppeteering and movement. So it's extremely, extremely dangerous. It causes violence, it causes death, but it goes beyond that to cause policies that harm people, policies that reduce the rights of the global majority. And for example, recently, if you look up some headlines, President Biden in the United States, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit US centric because that's where we're based. President Biden has come down hard on new immigration policy. And it is our theory and theory of others who pay attention to this, that the far right Great Replacement conspiracy theorists have pulled him to the right. So instead of meeting more in a sensible place where we're taking care of immigrants, where we have some sort of policies that help families and children who are coming to the United States for various reasons, oftentimes due to foreign policy decisions that the US makes, we are sliding to the right due to those talking points. And it's not only the far right extremists who are spewing them. We have a collection of quotes on our website from mainstream politicians, from mainstream media people in the US and beyond who spew these lies. So it's gone from the mainstream, it's gone from the fringes to the mainstream. Another example is recently in Ireland, there's ongoing protests about anti-immigrant protests, definitely emboldening the far right and spreading that Great Replacement theory. So I would be surprised if we don't see violence in Ireland connected with this anti-immigrant action that's happening. And then another example in the United States and around the world, there's this group, Proud Boys. You are probably familiar with them, white supremacists, misogynists, very violent. And they are coming, and this is another important point, they are coming to events that are led by local trans or LGBT activists. And so what we're seeing is a mix of racist, white supremacists coming in and glomming on to other movements that are restricting the rights of other people. We've seen this across the US, and those events turn violent, and they also create a opportunity for these movements to grow. And we saw the same thing with COVID. Across the world, there were marches against the closing down cities' policies, and at those marches, racist white supremacists glommed on in order to meet people where they were vulnerable, in order to meet people where they were angry, to grow their movement. So that's what we're seeing nationally, and it's quite scary. I'll end there for now. I'm happy to go on or answer any other questions, but the Great Replacement, I think, is one of the scariest global phenomenons that we're facing when it comes to racism these days.
No, thank you so much for that kind of synopsis of the key driving talking points or issues that's mobilizing this kind of growth of extremism and right-wing anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQI, anti-vaccine, and I would say Islamophobia is part of that as well, and others will add on. Abigail, you want to just talk to us about what the UN does here in South Africa and across the world, how it sees the current period, and what's the focus of its work at the moment? Thanks.
I mean, I think, Nishan, the first thing for me is to recognize that in the United Nations system, we have a variety of mechanisms that are dealing with issues around racism. And I think what's important is also to recall that actually it is because of the Sharpeville massacre here in South Africa that we have this International Day. against the elimination of racial discrimination. So I think the first thing really is to emphasize how a local country-specific situation led to a global understanding about racism and the need to commemorate this day, right? So I think the message there really is to say that, a country, a situation can actually lead to a whole global movement when we do begin to see backsliding on some of these issues. So of course we have the International Day, but that also led to, and it took several years, of course, to there being the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And of course, those countries who have ratified that instrument are subject to regular review of their compliance with those international standards, right? But besides that, we have the Special Rapporteur, and I do want to maybe touch on a very recent report that she issued on this topic to sort of share what she has found in her review of what's happening in these sort of populist movements around racism. But then, of course, we have a new anti-racism mechanism, which was really spawned out of the George Floyd incident, where we have a mechanism that's dealing with racial justice and inequality. And through that, we have a number of reports that are sort of reviewing the situation globally as well. And then, not least, we have other mechanisms, such as the one dealing with people of African descent, and the decade as well of people of African descent. So there are a number of mechanisms that exist, and they're all pointing essentially to significant concern in terms of the trend. But I think it is important to recognize that we do still have these legal standards that require us to actually push back against the pushback. So perhaps to enumerate a little bit in terms of the two most recent reports, and in particular maybe the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism. And I think what she has found is that she has looked at the whole issue around populist movements. But I think first of all, maybe before going into what she has found, let me say something about the global trend. So I think whilst there have been some initiatives in different parts of the world, I think our office has found that they have remained largely piecemeal. They really fall short of what is needed in terms of comprehensive evidence-based approaches that will really lead to the dismantling of entrenched structural, institutional, and societal racism. So the issue is systemic, and it requires a systemic solution. But we are really remaining largely on the superficial level. And this has to do with, as the previous speaker has already underscored, with centuries of discrimination that have inflicted harm on large swathes of communities. And the most visible impact of that is essentially the resurgence of national populism, as well as racial inequality that has really led to escalation of incidents of racist and xenophobic violence, crimes and hate speech literally all over the world. So now if I come a little bit to what the Special Rapporteur on racism has found, I think the first thing really is interesting, and when I was reviewing this again, I thought what was interesting is that she noted both the existence of both right-wing and left-wing populism, and how both of these approaches are adopting anti-establishment positions, which really call for the dismantling of liberal democratic institutions and hostility towards minorities. So whilst on the one hand, you have the right-wing populist that tends to be much more inward-looking and nationalistic in orientation, the left-wing populism is more orientated towards internationally, defined on the basis of class. And it's in its most virulent forms that both movements, whether on the right or on the left, they exhibit anti-pluralist commitments. So this whole idea that homogeneity is really not a good thing. But having said that, I think if we look then at what she has said in terms of right-wing nationalist populists, they regularly take the additional step of arguing that those identified as the people, as it were, are long-suffering victims of multicultural society, and that multiculturalism in itself is the driver of socioeconomic decline for the people, right? Of course, identifying only certain people as the people. So the end result of all of this is that often these types of nationalist populism, they often successfully are they lead towards advances in heteronormativity, patriarchal visions of a nation, and a version of traditional values that leads to serious violations against marginalized groups. That is women, people of gender and sexual minorities, and persons with disabilities. And especially those who are socially marginalized and also racial, ethnic, or religious minorities, as you have already underscored. So I thought maybe I could share, those findings, what I think is particularly pertinent with respect to that report that our office has issued.
No, thank you very much for that. The reports of the special rapporteur has been incredibly useful just to get a global sense of new trends and directions. I just hope that there would be a way in which those reports could have much more wider dissemination. But let's get Breitner just to talk to us about the work and what's been happening in Brazil. I think there's been some fascinating developments there. And I think just showing that a right-wing populist leader and movement can also be moved from power through democratic means, whether that was supported by a progressive call amongst those who voted Bolsonaro out. Hopefully you'd be able to tell us, Breitner. Over to you.
Yes, thank you again, Nishan. Well, first of all, I was just listening everyone before me, like Abigail and Christine, and I feel like we have many elements that's in common in Brazil about how this right-wing movement is organizing itself and start to push this kind of new populist agenda that they are based in a kind of hate against the institution, but in the back you have, of course, the desire of power and to push it based in the authoritarian perspective. So Brazil first is a country that is, need to consider the thing about to be a mixed race society, in which social barriers supposedly, in theory, that do not would interfere with interracial encounters. So there is in Brazil a kind of imagine the idea of what we call here the racial democracy. So we build this kind of ideology that here in Brazil would have a kind of racial democracy where everybody would be in the same point, everybody would be the same equal. So, but actually we have a strong inequality in Brazil. When we look, for example, in terms of demographics, we have actually 44% of the total population in Brazil are Black people. And of course, Black people, or Black is a social category that should be, understand in the specific context of Brazil. But in our case, we have about 54% of our population as a Black people that lives in a much more vulnerable position than the white population in general. In terms of education, for example, we have different ways for students to access the education, especially the higher education, where I'm trying to do some research right now. So we need to discuss this kind of ideology that is a way to understand that racism can be discussed as a structural element and of social relationships. So if you try to look at the recent history of Brazil, we will have at different moments the presence of Black movements in the public space. For example, National Black Front or Unified Black Movement. So when you ask us how can we face or can we struggle against the racism, my first answer would be, well, we should look to the social activism, how the Black people are trying to organize themselves. Yes, indeed, the contribution of this and other collectives actually they suffer from the invisibility of the mainstream social movements, and more specifically from the invisibility of the Black women participation. So it can be considered that several efforts to distributive public policies, and in case of Brazil, you have the affirmative action, have been observed in the last 20 years in Brazil. So we have to understand the right wing movement. We need to think about this.
Racism.
Need to listen to look to this last 20 years of Brazilian recent history. So this kind of racial quotas for Black students, universities, or public jobs were in this context a great achievement. However, we have that violence and inequality that continues strongly affect the Black population on several other levels. So many Black students, for example, find very difficult to stay in the university because they do not receive support for their stay during their course. So the ideology of meritocracy discourse covers up the racism that leads many students, for example, to physical or mental illness. So many students just have a very high dropout number. That's about 49% of the students just drop out, they give up. So we start to create public policies to create access to the higher education, for example, for Black students, for the low-income families. But many of these students, they cannot just stay. So visibly, the liberal development model assumed by the Brazilian state considerably increased the average of the consumerism of the working class. However, this economic growth that we had in these last 10 or 15 years was not accompanied by the content in terms of public health programs, education, or in public safety policies, especially for Black population, who obtained a superficial reach in the face of the real demands. So since 2013, I can say that we start to have a kind of reaction from this right wing. They start to criticize the government using these populist arguments about I would say the government not being fair, the corruption issue, and start to push the right-wing discourse that we need to push out this government. So in 2016, we had a kind of parliamentary coup in Brazil that removed the only female president ever in Brazil, that was Dilma Rousseff, that was from the party, the Work Party in Brazil. So this right wing just organized themselves in the parliament, and they pushed out in a kind of parliamentary coup in 2016, using this kind of arguments about corruption that never been proved actually. And in 2018, the former president Lula has been arrested with the same kind of argument to be supposedly involved in some corruption. And he went to the jail. He has been arrested as a political prisoner, actually. And so since 2018, 19 actually, we start the Bolsonaro time. So he became the president in Brazil, and he is from He used to be from the PSL, that's a very conservative party in Brazil, and then they moved it for another one that's the PL, the Liberal Party, that has actually the same approach. And he started to just to destroy, I would say, many public policies about affirmative actions, public policies for indigenous community. He started to facilitate the access to the forest, to minery, to take out the woods from the Amazon forest. So start to burn the forest. So in the university, the public in Brazil have a very big federal public university system. So we have about 70 universities that are public and free without no fees. It's just free for everyone. And it's about more than maybe, I'm not sure, maybe 400,000 students in the whole country. So it's a very big system. And they start to demantelate, to destroy, to disorganize without not supporting with financial source to keep working the university, the research and things like that. Because the university in Brazil, it has a very important position about to have the a critical mass, analyzing the government, criticizing this extreme, the right wing in Brazil. So the strategy for the government, the Bolsonaro, was to take up the money and try to privatize the public university. But unfortunately, he didn't get there about privatizing the university here in Brazil. And we have, sorry.
Thank you. I'm saying I think you need to just round up on this.
No problem. Okay, just a general approach about this structural thing about the whiting in Brazil. Okay, thank you.
And I think Brazil is important because it shows us what happens when racist right wing occupies the seats of government and what they do with the instruments of government thereafter, which is the theme hopefully others will also help to pick up on. Justine, show racism, the red card. What's the analysis from your side, and just what's some of the work that shows?
Thank you very much. As I've said, our work is primarily around the education of adults, but primarily with young people as well. And so one of the things that we're particularly looking at when we look at areas of far right is about educating young people beforehand, so they're not at risk, basically, of being co-opted onto these groups. Because I think all of us can quite realistically say that the world at the moment is a bit of a mess. Whether you're talking about environmentally, whether you're talking about economically, whether you're talking about from a peace process, obviously kind of like war in Europe at the moment, and many, many wars throughout the world, that is that, the world isn't in a great shape at the moment. And when that happens, people tend to get scared and worried. And the problem with fear is that's exactly what far right groups, they deliberately exploit fear. And so when people are having a hard life at the moment because they can't pay their gas and electricity bills and their food, what they're looking at is they're looking at somebody to blame. And rather than look at the systems and processes which has allowed this to happen, it's easier to just blame somebody else, somebody who might look a little bit different, or somebody who might be come from another country. And that's definitely something that the far right exploit. They exploit the fact that, say, for instance, immigrants should be blamed for these things. And it grows and festers with regards to the way people are thinking about these things. Kirsten mentioned something before politically around kind of like the political processes. Also mentioned something politically with regards to the UK, is that I feel that immigration is very much used as a stick, or rather than we say, there's a saying called throwing a dead cat on the table. I think that's what it is. Basically, when there are mistakes with regards to policy, when the government is a light is being shone on them, this is, or any political party rather, having a light shut on them or criticism shoved on them, the easiest thing at the moment in the UK is just to mention the word immigration. Okay, throw the word immigration out. Let's just blame the immigrants. Let's have a look at how many people are, and also extremely emotive and inaccurate language. Flooding, people are flooding across, or swarming, because if they're swarming, it makes them dehumanized. Not they're less than human, and therefore we can, justify the abuses that these people are put through. But they work that as a fear mechanism. So basically something happens, the government doesn't want people looking at that, and so we raise the issues around immigration, and that people are flooding in and swarming in, and it feeds into that fear, the fear of kind of like certain people with regards to a loss of identity, the fear with regards to a loss of culture as well with regards to things. And so they definitely, with regards to the young people we're talking about, exploit that. So one of the things that we try to do with young people and adults is to try to get them to think more critically, particularly from a media point of view, about the information that they see and hear. Because that is a particular way in which a lot of misinformation is being spread deliberately as well. And I think particularly in the area of media, or in my big bugbear, particularly the area of social media is brilliant. It does so many good things, but it does a lot of bad things as well. And the issue about social media with me, particularly around the area of the growth of the far right, is if I go back to when I was a teenager and I was a young person, yes, I knew that I had to, stay clear of people who might be involved in far right groups, but I don't think there was the worry about them that I have now, because they weren't very organized. And the posters you used to see badly tacked up on a lamppost were a hideous grammar, badly spelt, very poorly kind of like printed. And so you saw that these people weren't kind of like a risk. They became more of a risk to me in the work that I do, educating, when they became more publicity minded and savvy, okay, with the way that they reach out to people. So they won't say, "You big old racist, would you like to join us?" But they will say, "Do you like dogs? Do you like the countryside? Do you like each other?" The way that they work people in, okay, the way that they manipulate people, because they groom people basically into that. And so for us, it's about raising awareness and education for young people, so they'd be able to see that, be able to critically spot when that's happened, to remove that happening. Kirsten mentioned before as well about GRT, the great replacement theory. That is definitely something that is an issue to do with here in Europe, and also an issue with regards to the way that it is being pushed through certain far right groups here in the UK as well. And again, another worry from our point of view with regards to these kind of like far right groups is they're diversifying. It's not that it used to be at least here in the UK, I'm presuming it would be pretty much the same worldwide as well. There was a real stereotype of what a far right person would be. And traditionally they were seen as angry. They were seen as, well, young angry kind of like men, basically, young angry white men. And what we've found now is by diversifying, they're increasingly getting women involved. So women are more at the forefront of some of these groups to give what we call a less violent kind of like face to it. Much like has been mentioned by the people before as well, they're aligning themselves with interesting groups as well. So we often find far right groups coming on board here, for instance, talking about the rights of women in Islam. And so the idea is, we don't think that women in Islam should be, subjugated in this way, be forced to wear burqas, and all of this stuff again, which they're basically misinformation. But by aligning themselves with this group, it makes it look like they're being more legitimate, that they are looking, we're all into women's rights. Far right groups aren't into women's rights in the slightest. It just suits them at that time to align, because they know that there are people who may be uncomfortable to do with certain things to do with the Islam faith. So they'll go, right, well, we'll get them on this. We'll say, we're not being racist. It's nothing to do with Islam. We're coming on board because we're supporting women and the way that they're being subjugated by these people, which again is rubbish. And so we find a lot of these people that are pushing these in the far right groups are not only diversifying, but they're becoming quite young. So the head people And a lot of the groups that we particularly find threatening in Europe at the moment, a lot of those groups that are pushing the great kind of replacement theory also tend to be led by extremely tech-savvy university students. And they're able to attract more tech-savvy university graduates into it. So it's becoming very young, a younger demographic with regards to some of these people who are involved in these far-right groups who are extremely tech-savvy. And that is ridiculously dangerous, particularly because a lot of the people that they are reaching out to are much younger people. Again, the school age people that we're talking about, whether they be kind of teenagers or whatever, but are looking at the media and feeling threatened because of what they're hearing misinformation wise, aren't thinking about things critically. They're thinking about a loss of community or their identity. They may have had experiences or they may not. We live particularly here, but also a lot of the UK, it tends to be very white. So it means that people don't necessarily come into contact as much with people from different nationalities or cultures. And therefore there's a fear just because of the unknown rather than being able to talk about these things as well. And so we need to really think about some of the distractions that are happening, but also to think about the way in which the far right has changed. And the way they are far more adept with regards to communication. And so a lot of the work that we do, particularly in schools, is about that kind of like communication, about how to spot when people are being exploited, and also, particularly not just social media with regards to Facebook, but the TikToks and things of this world. Things spread so quickly, and if people are positioning themselves in a different way, that's why people think we go into schools and people think Andrew Tate's wonderful, because they don't really understand what he stands for, because they're not critically thinking about it, because the information isn't being given to them. So, and again, when we began, Abigail was talking about the individual responsibilities of individuals. Yeah, that's what I'm here to talk about. Our responsibilities as individuals to not just educate the people around us and challenge kind of those things around us, but also take responsibility for challenging whether it be myths or kind of like stereotypes or these kind of things, because otherwise this is what you get. You get somebody, oh, Andrew Tate's in a shiny kind of like fast sports car. He must be kind of like wonderful, having a wonderful life, not thinking about the misogyny, the sexism, the racism that's behind it. And that's what a lot of these far right groups are doing as well. So basically, I think a lot of the groups that we're involved with, it's not just about making people more savvy, about more recognizing when they're being manipulated, whether that be on a social media post or in a video game. So for instance, the people that we work with, we're doing a tremendous amount of work about racism in online and gaming. The way that racism is spreading through the gaming community, or small section, should we say, of the gaming community, is scary. And far-right groups are particularly using this to be able to identify isolated, frustrated, confused, particularly young men, but young women as well, and be able to manipulate them into their groups, because as I've said, they're a lot more adept at doing it than they used to be as well. So I just think we need to up our game with regards to not just our own individual responsibility, but taking care, if you are a parent, of what your children are seeing online, because you might go, oh, that site might not be suitable for them, it's a bit violent, or that site might not be suitable because there might be inappropriate sexual content, but they're really not looking at the big picture in the way that the youth can be manipulated quite easily, particularly disenfranchised young people have been manipulated quite easily by some of these groups. Yeah, so.
Now, fascinating. Also, just I've been very impressed with Show Racism, the Red Card, and your response to the whole Gary Lineker issue, and the kind of support that's been galvanized around him. I think it's been vital to the pushback on that narrative that's emerged, and has taken on the BBC in a way that I don't think they anticipated. So I mean, just well done to yourselves there. I want to take the remaining time just to talk about, I mean, what's coming through from all of this, from all of your inputs. The right, the far right, the alt-right, whatever we call them, seems to be much more coherent, organized. They've got a script that no matter which part of the world you're in, everybody's speaking from. They have an organizational approach that is almost similar, irrespective of where they are in the world. And South Africa is no exception. Right-wing groups here have connections with right-wing groups across the world, but they almost share the same narrative. They are all victims. They know how to play up that kind of victim story. They know how to connect across the world. The Great Replacement theory is something that you've now seen in Tunisia in a big way. When a head of state makes those kinds of comments, you see the attacks now on migrants and others in Tunisia, and I suppose in many parts of Africa, it's the kind of story that's now playing across the world. The Global Project Against Hate and Extremism writes that social media has been fundamental to the rise of far-right and authoritarian politicians and government. And their reports, I think, have incredible insights into just how this has come about. So it's worth sharing. What I want to get to now is, if that's the analysis, what's missing in the response to this global threat? What needs to be done, and perhaps who needs to do it? Let's just get your thoughts on that, and perhaps start with Breitner first.
Well, yeah, I mean, in Brazil, of course, we have this kind of international connections. The former president, Lula, just won again the elections last year. She just started his new time as a president right now. And the former president, Bolsonaro, just took a flight and went to the United States, where he was right now. He is right now in Florida, and building his, connections with the international right wing, and of course he doesn't want to come to Brazil right now because he would go to the jail very, very quickly because he committed a lot of crimes. But he's still, of course, trying to make it the dynamics of the right wings is working internationally. United States and some countries in Europe, they have this basis to support this kind of actions that have spreading in Brazil right now. In Brazil now we have a very strong, we have a very interesting moment right now. I would say more positive, I would say, for the progressive side, that are trying to rebuild the idea about the relevance of the democracy for the country. This as institutional and as a way to promote like public policies and equality for the more vulnerable people, in addressing issues like connected to the racism and discrimination that you have in schools, in their work, and in the public sphere, public spaces, and so on. So I mean, in the case of Brazil, I think we always have in our history the racism as a basis to the social stratification. The difference right now is those people, these people that have this conservative perspective, they don't feel more ashamed to express their perspective in the public space. So the people start to express racist and misogynist, sexist prejudice in the public space, and now those people that are more for progressive perspectives are trying to organize. Just for example, very quickly, for example, the curricula for the high school and the elementary school will have some discussions about the African identity in Brazil. So it starts to create a new perspective about ourselves. We start to have another view about who we are. So the idea about the blacks not more only connected to the negative things, but positive things also. So people that suffer racism, prejudice, racist discrimination, they start to react also to the racism, violence that we have in the school or in the work, on the streets, everywhere. So in Brazil, we are having a new time in the government, for example, many public policies about this kind of curricula to make their African heritage as a main point, or for example, create quotas for have more diversity in the high level jobs, like having Black, indigenous, and all the kind of Brazilians, not only white Brazilians. So right now, from the state and from the social movements to start to have more, more flourishing, I would say. But of course, this post-pandemic time, if you consider the consequence about economic issues, for example, we need to be very, I would say, aware in terms of supporting those more vulnerable. Otherwise, they will be very easy victims of this fake news and this ideology about, oh, see, they are not doing anything. They keep being like, corrupt and things like that. So the government and social movement need to be very organized and aware in terms of really supporting the bases. Because just to conclude, I feel like the left, the more progressive parties and movements in Brazil, they lost a little bit, the way how to renew themselves, to be really in the communities. So you need to renew the left and the social movements to make it more reasonable for people. So that's the way that I think that Brazil maybe can go, just to face this right wing right now. They are silent, I would say. They are after January 8th, when they try to attack the parliament, maybe you saw in the news. After that, they start to feel silent because the police start to arrest the right-wing manifestants and terrorists. So now they are more quiet, but of course they didn't give up. But they're still trying to, to create this idea about the democracy institutions, the equality and diversity in Brazil. Anyway, we should be positive and trust in the future. Anyway.
No, lovely sentiments about the need for hope, and that hope resides in a progressive state using instruments like changing the curriculum, dealing with issues of inequality, but importantly, the collaboration between parts of the state, social movement, civil society to tackle this problem is perhaps what is the missing element in a number of countries. Abigail, from the side of the UN, where do you see the kind of work that needs to be done? What is it that needs to be done other than what you've already mentioned? And perhaps also a reflection on, if you have, just on Tunisia and other parts of the continent where we don't think that the right wing is present, but in many ways they actually are. Just your comments on those as well, please.
Yeah, Nishan, I first of all just really want to appreciate the inputs also from the fellow panelists. I think for me, I think the first point that I really wanted to make is just to really underscore that, this whole idea that the people matter, right? I think sometimes we forget the power of the people, right? And I think there is very important message that, how a groundswell of people can actually impact and make change. But I think what's important is that somehow the pushback against sort of this sort of trend that we're seeing is somehow we go back to the basics in terms of building coalitions. The way that it was done before when the global human rights movement made its gains, right? And I think even when we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we're celebrating 75 years, I think what was so fundamentally important is that you had this global movement. You also had a context, but you certainly had a global movement. And I think it's each of us individually that is contributing to this whole notion of we the people that we tend to find in most Bill of Rights, including in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that's maybe the first point that I really wanted to underscore. The second thing really is to reiterate that the issue is systemic. And because of the fact that it is systemic, it requires a systemic response. And I think what we've tended to see so far is sort of like a very peripheral approach, you know, a sort of like, you know, just sealing the wound, but not really getting to the root of the issues, right? And I think until we really begin to look at institutionalized racism, we really won't be able to, this thing is going to continue to rear its ugly head. And so because it is systemic, it requires a systemic response. And that's why part of our campaign is, as I mentioned in the beginning, is this whole idea of listening, speaking up, and act. And I think many of the panelists have already spoken to this idea. But I just want to reiterate why it's so important to listen, and especially to listen in this moment in time. Because up until now, people have never really been willing to listen to people who have been affected by racism. It always been, oh, you know, this person is exaggerating, it's overstated, right? So I think a very fundamental point is that people are willing to hear those who are affected by, you know, the situation. What is it that they're experiencing? And that we're actually willing to hear it. And to be able to create those spaces where they're heard. And I think the colleague has already alluded to some of the work that they're doing in this regard. And I think it's really, I think that is part of the beginning, as it were. But the next thing is really this whole idea of speaking up. And speaking up for us is like not accepting to be a bystander. You know, we cannot allow ourselves to be like, oh, well, that's not really affecting me, so I'm not going to say anything about it, right? I think it really requires all of us to be in a position where we really make the decisive decision that we are going to be speaking up about some of these challenges. And then the third point really that is around acting. I think really I think what is fundamentally important is that we first and foremost recognize that these populist ideologies around racial superiority and practices are completely contrary to international human rights law or human rights law, just broadly speaking, and that they should actually be legally challenged. We need to have, you know, the judiciary that's involved in this, as much as we need leadership. We need to be demonstrating that, you know, this is actually contrary and not sort of allowing these issues to be silenced. Another important point, I think, is really to look at monitoring hate speech, because hate is a virus. It spreads extremely fast, and hate speech has, as all of the colleagues have stated, they have various mediums, new technologies now of being able to spread misinformation, disinformation, and hate. So I think that really needs to be monitored very carefully, including, I would say, politicians who have an important leadership role, and especially around electoral periods, because I think that's where we really begin to see a heightening of some of this hate. Then I think another area is we need to also monitor how this type of discrimination is feeding or, you know, gently sweeping into laws and policies, right? So we're seeing this manifested through whether it is voter suppression aimed at racial or ethnic or other minorities. We're seeing this through constitutional or legislative amendments against certain groups from being able to participate in political life. But we're also seeing this in terms of restrictions to access to public goods and services, your everyday goods and services, that somehow certain groups are you know, being excluded, or they're being restricted in terms of being able to access those services. So we need to be looking at how that it's manifesting in those spheres, and trying to also address that. And with that also, I think, as has already been underscored, we need to have some kind of a strong attention in terms of the media and the internet's responsibility, the digital sphere. And then maybe just finally to say that, of course, our High Commissioner has written to member states today in commemoration of this International Day, to really urge them that, you know, the time is nigh. We are in a state of, you know, the very difficult situation, and it's really important that they take the responsibility of ensuring that they adopt the appropriate laws and policies, including, and not least, you know, follow up to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action that was hosted here in South Africa, as you know, Nishan. But maybe I'll end there just with those couple of thoughts.
No, I think, thank you very much, and some very specific action points that you've highlighted, which I want to ask Justine, just to pick up on where Show Racism, the red card, thinks, what are the gaps? What else do they think needs to be done? And I know Show Racism, the red card, does extremely good work within the sporting arena, primarily using footballers in schools. But what else is happening in the UK to combat what is a wider societal problem? And what are the gaps that you think globally as well would need to be attended to? Justin?
I think with regards to our organisation position about what needs to be done globally and really what we think needs to be done nationally, you could just go back, rewind, and just listen to what Abigail's just said there, because pretty much everything that Abigail's just mentioned there is on my tick list of things that could really be done with regards to help. But just picking up on one of her points, I suppose, really, is about the area of individual responsibility. So if we, of all of the other areas, obviously are very important, but the area of individual responsibility is one that we, particularly from an education kind of point of view, are trying to push. Because the fact is, and I know we talk about this when we talk about it with kids, you know, so we don't need to talk about it with adults, is people are not born racist, okay? It's learned behavior. And so if something's learned, it can be unlearned, or rather we could put mechanisms into place to make sure, as I say, I know I say it all the time, critical thinking. We want people to see, and we want people to think about the information that they see and hear. And so from a young person's perspective, the work that we do in schools, as you've mentioned there, kind of Nishan, and with kind of like adults, is about the individual responsibility of, because we know that people aren't born this way, because we know that there's an escalation. So for instance, well, there's a pyramid, an escalation of prejudice, which is by Gordon Allport. If any of you have seen Allport's model of kind of escalation, basically he has it like a pyramid. And what he's saying is that the bottom of that pyramid, the foundation of that pyramid, whatever holds that up is what all of us at one point have been party to. So if you haven't challenged a racist joke, or you've laughed at a sexist joke, you've believed a stereotype of some type or bias, we're contributing to the next stage up in that pyramid, and that next stage escalates. It goes on to acts of bias, for instance, i.e. making the jokes, etc. Then it can lead on to discrimination, and then it can lead on to violence, and finally the top of the pyramid is with regards to genocide. And so although there's a thing that says, oh well, jokes lead to genocide, what we're meaning by, if you are tolerating, okay, racist behavior, even if it is down to a stereotype, language and terminology and jokes, if you are tolerating that in society and with people around you, then obviously there are some people from that society that are going to escalate that behavior to where we see the behavior that we see in far right, including kind of people with loss of life. However, if everybody did not tolerate that and challenged when they heard a racist joke, or challenged when somebody said something sexist, or turned on the news and went, actually, you know what, that isn't right, that is a distraction, or heard a rumor and went, don't think that could be true. If people thought about actually challenging these actions, it removes the bottom part of that pyramid, the whole thing collapses, and we don't get the co-option into the far right groups that we do. So one of the things that I actually think things are looking up, I agree with Kirsten at this moment, as far as far right's concerned. No, it's not great at all. It always used to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and this time it seems to be 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I think we are in a very grave situation. However, from what I can say in the UK with young people, is there is a positive note there. They're far more informed about different cultures. They're far more accepting of other cultures and sexualities and ability statuses. And what we need to do is make sure that we continue to encourage and foster that, foster the openness, foster the communication, foster young people and adults, that is, feeling comfortable talking about these things in order to attack and dismantle some of, as I've said, kind of like the misappropriation with regards to things, which is why we're getting kind of people believing these myths and rumors, which can in themselves lead them into racist behavior, which again, you know, when exploited by those who know how to exploit it, can end up in far right and extreme far right groups. So education is key. I'm bound to say that. And if I could say one thing on this stage that we need to do, that we're pushing at the moment, and also Brayton has mentioned something with regards to curricula, so I will agree, we need to get differing kinds of history on the UK curriculum. If people think Black people, Asian people, people from the Middle East, Chinese people, wherever, if they think we have not contributed anything to society, then obviously that helps kind of like spread those that kind of like misinformation. So we need to get that in the curricula. And my big bugbear at the moment is in England and Wales, teachers who are educated and therefore to become teachers are not required to have a single day of a quality education. A single day. And so then we get a situation where a teacher may be placed into an extremely diverse school, never having come into contact with anybody from any ethnic minority group, and we expect them to be able to educate on this, to treat that person culturally kind of like respectfully, and to do so with the rest of the class. It's unfair on the teacher and it's unfair on the children. So my big push would be, we need to make sure that we get anti-racism, equality across the board, several other strands, really good quality training in before teachers go into schools, because they are the people who are educating the next generation, and the next generation are the people who are going to be leading them. I always leave a school kind of like class by going, I can't make a difference. I'm in my 50s now. I can make many differences and I will continue to try. I'm not going to change the world. You are, 10-year-old boy and girl. You're going to change the world, and the way that you can do that is by making the world a bit fairer. So it's about encouraging people to think about things from a fair point of view. It's not about asking for more, which is sometimes what far right groups like to persuade people. It's about grabbing things. And I think there's a meme I saw the other day when equal rights isn't pie. You know, it's not like we're going to run out of it. We're not taking your rights away by giving more rights to another person. It's about fairness. And so I think that's something that we need to maybe instill in our young people, our adults, and our teachers.
Great. Let me just say at 50, I think you can be doing much, much more. Don't take 50 as a kind of point where you need to start slowing down. Take it from a 60-year-old that there's still much more you can do in the next decade as well. Christine, there's a question that I'd like you to just respond to. What would the panel say that the rise of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson is what perpetuated the rise of the far right? Or was their rise just a sign of the far right that has already been established, and that those politicians made use of who then made use of it in their rise to power? Now, in your response, just you might want to also just talk about the point that's been made here about the need for curriculum change and the challenges in the US around book bans, the pushback against critical race theory. And in that context, what is it that you, from the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, think that is still required globally to be done to counter this, the challenge that we've been talking about? I know it's a big ask, but try to respond to them if you can.
Sure, absolutely. First, Justine, I have a 10-year-old at school, public school, and I wish that you could just come into their classroom and speak to them. It's so powerful to educate the young people. So thank you for your work. I think in broad sense, the answer to that question is that a lot of our countries, a lot of our societies were built on the far right, on how we define the far right today, on white supremacy, on racism. So I think that has always been around, at least in the US, for instance, right? I mean, that's how our country came to be. We wouldn't have called it the far right back then, but clearly that is how our country was built. By, throughout history, the powers that be, usually white men, conquering by dividing people. And that's what we're seeing today. We are seeing these politicians dividing people in order to build their base and in order to ultimately prevail in elections, unfortunately. So I don't think that Trump or Johnson necessarily perpetuated the rise of the far right. What I think they did in many ways is give it life again and embolden people, white people, to act on their racism that they had, that's been ingrained in people, because like Justine said, it is a learned trait, and also perpetuated and emboldened them because of our education systems to start to go into that direction. In the United States, we do have a huge far right movement to critical race theories, a little bit more advanced toward universities, but even in our public education system, we don't learn history the way history happened. We learned a whitewashed version of it from kindergarten through grade school through high school. So unless you are a critical thinker on your own, you oftentimes aren't even given access to the educational resources to learn about how the history and even modern day racism exists. So I think that's a major, major problem. Depending on the young people to bring us forward, sometimes they don't have access. And I'm not, across the board, white, Black, immigrants, nobody has access to the real, truthful history of our country and of the world. So I think that's a major, major problem. We have another, I think Mr. Tavares said it about privatization of education in Brazil. We have that same issue in the United States, to the extent that recently in the news we saw a neo-Nazi couple homeschooling their kids, and they're getting funding for basically their neo-Nazi education of their youth. So it's a major problem to privatize. We have far-right religious nationalists trying to get public funding to have religious schooling, which of course in the United States is against our Constitution. So major, major issues in the foundation. But I do think to broaden back out a little bit, I think how to move forward is something all the speakers have just said. I think it goes from the international level, from the UN, from other international organizations, all the way down to the local level, of being engaged, of being willing and wanting to talk about how we can cut through racism. Racism is a through line of everything in our lives. And until we recognize that, we're not going to be able to move forward as societies. And one thing that we focus on at Global Project is the tech. So I want to echo one thing that Justine had said, that it's personal responsibility. I think in addition to that, we have the responsibility to hold tech companies accountable, not to allow them to spread the hate, the disinformation, the fear, the separating language that they so often do. And these are huge profitable companies. They put profit above everything else. They don't have another responsibility. So we need to pressure them. We need to pressure them to put humanity before their profit. And I think we can do that through legislation. I think we can do that through movement building and pressure. Through advertisers, because that's how they make their money. So the minute advertisers stand up and say, you know what, I'm not going to give Meta or YouTube my money, they are literally spreading hate. And then that goes down to the young people, right? That's what the young people are learning from, is this disinformation. So I think a big part of our responsibility is to hold tech companies accountable to getting that stuff off their platforms, particularly politicians. A lot of the tech companies have a political exemption. So if it's considered newsworthy, oftentimes by a politician, let's say Donald Trump, clearly incited violence, calls to violence for the January 6th insurrection, that should have been stopped before it was allowed to spread. Or we had Bolsonaro in his last run, and probably all the runs before that, where he used social media, speaking untruth, speaking hate against the indigenous population in Brazil. What is the goal of that? For him is to grow his base. But for the rest of us, we see it on social media, and that's how these movements spread. That's how the conversation goes in the wrong direction. So we're strong supporters of getting rid of political exemptions. That politicians should be treated like the rest of us. If what they say is untrue, if what they say is spreading hate and disinformation, it shouldn't have a platform. So that's a major part of our work. So I hope that answered your question a lot, but I think what I take home from all this and from what all the other panelists have said is it takes all of us. It takes the institutions at the international level all the way down to each and every one of us as individuals, as community members, as parents, as advocates across the world, and connection. And I'll just leave with saying we are part of a global alliance against digital hate and extremism, where we have about 70 organizations internationally who are doing just that, trying to hold tech companies to account, to get rid of some of these positions and policies they have that are really harming all of us. And I think one of the other panelists said, if one person is suffering, we are all suffering. And until we all have that perspective, we cannot move forward. So, one day they might come for you, right? So we need to hold up, we need to support each other, we need to come together to fight all forms of hatred, racism, and bigotry.
No, thank you very much for that. As we move towards closing, I just want to share some of Mr. Kathrada's speech to the UN on International Day for the Elimination of Racism. I think this was in 2015 or 16. And it's all speech around the role of leaders in mobilizing political will to combat racism and racial discrimination. And he says in the speech, once racism has contaminated the minds of otherwise sensible people, it can be maddeningly stubborn and unresponsive to logic. Racism shaped our history, and I would say that of the world, and it guides the present in powerful ways. It continues to dictate and influence the types of people we live near, go to school with, and tolerate, befriend, love, marry, hate, fight, and kill. It also influences our decisions about which people we help or neglect in times of need. In short, racism squanders human potential. He writes further, my visit to Auschwitz in 1951 made me realize just how far racists would go to achieve their goals. He then talks about Auschwitz not having started when Hitler assumed power. The death camps were the final stop for millions. The road to there stretched far into the past. It was a road built by racism, colonialism, and centuries of such evils, but sadly continues far beyond the Holocaust today. It has planted stop signs in Bosnia, Rwanda, Sudan, and now the Central African Republic. He then looks at the Durban Conference and says, the gap between commitments made at the Durban Conference against racism and concrete actions that was taken, and in an address to the UN High Commissioner, was in your view large and regrettable. Then talks about the UN Rapporteur's special report of 2006 and talks about parties moving from the marginal to the mainstream and now being able to access political institutions of the state. Once state power has been captured, the possibility of them taking direct, legitimate action to transform society into what their worldview would be is very realistic. They have literally emerged from the backwoods of marginality by taking part in public demonstration and events made possible by the democratic legitimization of racist and xenophobic ideas. And he concludes his speech by asking, he says, I have struggled to find the green piece of anti-racism today. While there are many good and effective local and national anti-racism organizations, I am not aware of a global civil society movement against racism and discrimination. Perhaps we have paid too much attention to governments and their role, and not sufficient to those closest to the people in civil society. And in there, I suppose, is really a call that we hope to discuss with Abigail and others about at least some kind of global connecting point of all anti-racist or anti-hate organizations, just to share information of who's where in the world and who's doing what. Not necessarily a new entity, but at least some basic connecting points which the right have been very good at doing, but we haven't been. So I want to just express from my side just a gratitude to all of you and call on our anti-racism manager, Retabile Rotsomo, to do the closing remarks. Retabile, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bolton. I just want to express my gratitude just to everyone for joining us today as we commemorated both the Human Rights Day and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I think very valuable and important points were raised in this panel today that gives us all perspectives on how racism continues to affect us systemically as well as individually, and how we can contribute to combating it. Today marks the end of Anti-Racism Week as well, which is held by the Anti-Racism Network South Africa and is observed annually between the 14th and the 21st of March. This week serves to educate and promote awareness on racism and all its different forms. And today we've heard on how education is a key to retaliating against right-wing populism that has transnational growth and affects us all in our day-to-day life. Thank you once again to everyone for joining us, and a special thank you to our panelists for making the time to contribute to this very special discussion and important discussion that we had today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to connect with you all. And thank you to the Kathrada Foundation for organizing this. Nishan, I met Ahmed Kathrada in Geneva when he made that speech. So thank you for reminding us of it. It really
Thanks, Abigail. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much as well for having me, and also thank you very much to the other panelists. And one of the reasons why I love doing these things is you all give me food for thought, and I'm just about to rush off now and start reading lots of little bits of articles about some of the things that you've mentioned here. It's always a learning process. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, a huge thanks to everybody for listening and for having us. It's such an honor to have been invited to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, the panelists, everyone. I learned a lot today. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Bretna. Thank you.